Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I sat still, my gaze locked onto her, waiting silently for her to feel the weight of her own words. Her arms were rigidly crossed over her chest, chin tilted just enough to challenge me, daring me to fold under the pressure of her ultimatum. Give in to her conditions or watch our closeness dissolve. But it wasn't her words that rattled me. It was the certainty in her voice, the expectation that I'd crumble, beg, or scramble to win back her affection. That's when it all clicked. This wasn't a spontaneous fight blown out of proportion. It wasn't about one argument. It was a familiar loop, a pattern of control cleverly disguised as ordinary marital discord. And I had been complicit for far too long. A genuine, almost incredulous laugh escaped me, the kind you release when something is so absurd it borders on surreal. Her eyes widened briefly, betraying her surprise, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "What's so funny?" she snapped. I leaned back, letting the last traces of amusement fade before meeting her eyes. "Perfect. Keep it." Silence settled between us. She blinked, waiting for me to backtrack, to claim I hadn't meant it, or that I was speaking out of anger. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply finished. Standing up from my chair, I grabbed my phone and walked out of the room. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just a calm, resolute departure. For the first time in our relationship, I felt no need to justify myself. I had no interest in debating or proving her wrong. Let her sit with it. Let her realize her tactics had finally lost their grip. I went to the bedroom, collected a pillow and blanket, and moved into the guest room without a word. No slamming doors, no sarcastic remarks, just distance. She didn't follow, not immediately. She probably thought I just needed time to cool down, that I'd come back in a few hours with an apology, eager to smooth things over. Maybe she believed I'd try to bargain, offering compromises to regain the intimacy she was withholding. But I didn't want anything from her. Lying in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, the truth settled in. I wasn't afraid of losing her. I felt free. The next morning, I woke up early, lighter than I had in years. No tension in my chest, no knot in my stomach, no urge to repair what she had fractured. When I entered the kitchen, she was already there, seated at the table with her arms crossed, her expression expectant, waiting for me to bring up the night before. I poured myself a coffee, sat down across from her, completely unfazed. She cleared her throat. "So, are you done being childish?" I took a slow sip, letting her words hang in the air. Then I smiled. "Yeah, actually I am." Her eyes narrowed slightly, confused. She anticipated a fight, a plea, a negotiation. But none of that came. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked away. That was the first crack in her armor, the first moment she realized something was different. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. The silence unnerved her. For years, our conflicts followed a predictable script. She'd push, I'd resist, she'd escalate, and eventually I'd yield, either by apologizing to end the tension or giving in to avoid another exhausting argument. But this time, I gave her nothing. No reaction, no anger, no desperate attempts to fix things. I simply withdrew. I went about my day as if nothing had happened. I left the house without explaining where I was headed. I returned without seeking her out. I spoke only when necessary, and even then, my words were short, neutral, detached. She hated it. At first, she pretended not to care. She'd roll her eyes when I passed by quietly, scoff when I ignored her passive-aggressive remarks. But after a few days, the facade began to crack. The first real sign of panic emerged when she tried to provoke me. I was lounging in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when she plopped down on the couch opposite me. She didn't speak right away, just sat there, waiting for me to acknowledge her. When I didn't, she let out an exaggerated sigh. So this is how it's going to be now? I didn't even look up. What are you talking about? I replied flatly. You. This whole ignoring me thing. I finally met her gaze. I'm not ignoring you. Oh, really? Because it sure feels like it. I shrugged. I'm just done wasting energy on pointless conversations. Her jaw clenched. Oh, I get it. So because you didn't get your way, now you're throwing a tantrum? I actually laughed at that. A tantrum. I was calmer than I had ever been. She wasn't used to this. She was used to me fixing things, to me taking responsibility for problems she created. She was accustomed to having the upper hand, but now she had nothing. The real shift came later that evening. She was standing by the sink after dinner, waiting for me to speak. I could sense it, her growing desperation. Normally, this would be the point where I'd cave, trying to mend things and pretend everything could go back to normal. Instead, I grabbed my glass of water, took a sip, and left the kitchen without a word. And that's when she finally understood. She was no longer in control. The silence between us wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was a fundamental shift in how I approached my life. I had nothing left to say to her, nothing left to fight for. But for the first time in years, I had someone else to focus on, myself. I didn't make any grand declarations about it. I didn't sit her down and say, I'm changing my life now. No. I just started living differently, without her permission, without her validation, and without hesitation. The first thing I did was fix my sleep schedule. For too long, I'd been trapped in sleepless nights, replaying arguments in my head, bracing for the next inevitable clash. But now, I went to bed early in my own space and woke up feeling clear-headed. Then I joined a gym nearby. Nothing fancy, just a place where I could lift, sweat, and rebuild myself from the inside out. That first week was brutal. My body ached in ways I hadn't felt in years, but I welcomed it. Every sore muscle was proof of progress, a sign that I was reclaiming control in a way she couldn't touch. She noticed, of course. I could feel her eyes on me when I returned from workouts, drenched in sweat, breath heavy. At first, she pretended indifference, but she was always watching, sneaking glances whenever I grabbed my gym bag or downed a protein shake. I started dressing better too. Not for her, not for anyone else. For me. I tossed out old clothes I had clung to for far too long and replaced them with things that made me feel good. I got a proper haircut, not the half-hearted trims I used to settle for. When I looked in the mirror, I began to recognize myself again. Then I started going out. At first, it was simple, grabbing coffee alone, going for walks, reconnecting with friends I'd drifted from over the years. But eventually, I started truly living again. I accepted invitations I would have declined before, went to bars, met new people, and every time I stepped out the door, I felt a little freer. The more I focused on myself, the less space she occupied in my mind. And that's when she truly began to panic. She felt me slipping away, and it terrified her. At first, she hid it behind a mask of apathy. She'd roll her eyes when I headed out, toss a sarcastic comment about my gym routine, or let out a dismissive laugh when I walked by in a sharp new outfit. But I saw through it, the tiny cracks in her cool demeanor whenever she realized her indifference didn't faze me. And then, slowly, things started to change. It began with the smallest shifts. One evening, as I walked past her on my way to the kitchen, her arm brushed mine, the first accidental touch in weeks. A few nights later, she hovered in the doorway of the bedroom I'd moved into, leaning against the frame like she had something to say. But no words came. She just stood there, waiting for an invitation that never arrived. Then she pressed further. One morning, as I tightened my laces before heading to the gym, her voice softened to a near whisper. "You've been out a lot lately." I tied the last knot, grabbed my bag, and shot her a glance. "Yeah." She hesitated. Doing what, exactly? I gave her a faint smile. Living. That one hit home. I saw it in the slight parting of her lips, like she wanted to fire back but couldn't find the words. This wasn't how it was supposed to play out. She was supposed to have the upper hand, to keep me chasing her attention, not the other way around. But now, she was the one left wondering where I was going, who I was with, and what I was doing. The control she once had over me? Gone. She tried to pull me back in the only way she knew how. One night, as I stood in the kitchen, she leaned against the counter beside me, fingers drumming like it was casual. But it wasn't. You know, she began, her voice laced with something dangerously close to desperation. We don't have to keep doing this. It doesn't have to be like this between us. I didn't reply. The silence grew heavier. She edged closer. I miss you. That was new. I turned to meet her gaze. Miss me? Like it was a foreign language. She nodded, her fingers tracing lightly down my arm, the same woman who once used intimacy as leverage now offering it freely. I let her touch linger for a moment before gently pulling away, grabbing my glass of water and walking out. That was when she knew she'd lost, but she wasn't ready to give up. After that night, something in her snapped. The fake indifference vanished. She switched to full-blown damage control. At first, her efforts were subtle, hovering nearby as if by chance, sitting just a little too close on the couch, asking about my day like she suddenly cared. But when I didn't bite, she escalated. One evening, as I got ready to head out, she appeared in the doorway of my room now, watching me fasten my watch. Going out again? I didn't even look at her. Yeah. With who? I smirked slightly, adjusting my sleeve. Does it matter? That stung. I saw it in the way she swallowed, her fingers tightening around the doorframe. It's just, you never used to go out this much. I finally faced her, my expression unreadable. Yeah, I never used to do a lot of things. She stared, waiting for something, anything, that might suggest I wasn't completely gone. But I gave her nothing. I grabbed my keys, brushed past her, and left. The grip she had on me? Dead. She must have known, deep down, that she'd lost me. But instead of accepting it, she made one last desperate move. Guilt. A few days later, I walked in to find her sitting at the table, staring at her hands, waiting. I almost walked past, but she spoke. Can we talk? I sighed, already knowing where this was headed, but I sat down anyway, resting my hands on the table. Go ahead. She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I don't know what's happening between us. I raised an eyebrow. Really? She ignored my tone. I don't want to fight anymore. I tilted my head slightly. This isn't a fight. It's just reality catching up to you. Her eyes flickered with something close to panic. It doesn't have to be like this. We can fix things. I know I haven't been perfect, but... Stop. She flinched, not from my tone, which was calm, but because I wasn't following the script she'd prepared. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. You want the truth? She nodded, clinging to the last shred of hope. I don't want this anymore. Silence. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. I leaned forward, my voice steady. I don't hate you. I don't even care enough to be angry. But I see you for who you are now, and I'm done pretending this marriage is anything more than a cage I let myself live in for too long. Her breath hitched. So that's it? You're just giving up? I shook my head. No, I'm finally choosing myself. I stood up, walked to the counter, grabbed my phone, and dialed a number. When she heard me say, I'd like to schedule a consultation with a divorce attorney, she finally broke. But by then, it wasn't my problem anymore. She cried, she begged, she threw everything she had at me to change my mind, but it was too late. Once the divorce process began, she swung between anger and self-pity. Some days, she hurled accusations like blaming me could rewrite reality. Other days, she played the victim, acting as though she was the one being abandoned. But none of it worked. I had nothing left to give. And the best part? I didn't feel guilty, not even for a second. The old me would have agonized over this, second-guessed every step, wondered if there was anything left to save. But now, I felt nothing but relief. I moved out before the paperwork was finalized, packing my things in silence while she stood in the doorway, watching. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "You're just walking away like I meant nothing to you." I zipped my suitcase, turning to her with an unreadable expression. "No, I'm walking away because I finally realized I meant nothing to you." She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I grabbed my bag, walked past her, and left that house, our house, for good. Life after her? It was better than I ever imagined. I found my own place, a space that was entirely mine. No tension, no manipulation, no more walking on eggshells, just peace. I kept hitting the gym, kept dressing sharp, kept saying yes to new experiences. I met new people, went on dates, not to prove anything, but because I could. And I thrived. Meanwhile, she didn't. Word got back to me through mutual friends. She wasn't handling the divorce well. She spiraled, pretending everything was fine while everyone around her saw the cracks. She'd spent so long trying to control me, she never considered what would happen when I was gone. Now she was the one drowning in regret. But I never looked back. Not once. I didn't need revenge. I didn't care if she suffered. None of it mattered anymore. I was free. And that was all that ever mattered. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, subtle at first, easy to ignore, but as time went on, they became impossible to overlook. The woman I had sworn to spend my life with no longer felt like the same person. Or maybe she was, and I had simply never truly understood her to begin with. It wasn't a sudden revelation. There was no catastrophic argument, no single moment of betrayal that shattered everything. Instead, it was a gradual unraveling, like the slow erosion of sand by the tide, until one day I realized the foundation beneath me was gone. In the beginning, we had been inseparable. We had our own world, inside jokes, whispered conversations in the dark, small rituals that made life feel significant. But as time passed, something changed. Or maybe, in her eyes, I hadn't changed enough. At first, the differences were almost too small to notice. A half-hearted chuckle at a joke she once adored. A distracted, "yeah, okay," when I shared something about my day. She began dressing differently, speaking differently, surrounding herself with a new crowd. I wanted to be supportive. Growth is natural, isn't it? People evolve, adapt. Maybe I was the one refusing to move forward. Then came the criticisms. "You should update your style. Why do you talk like that? It's so bland. Ever thought about changing your hair? You've looked the same for years." I brushed it off. Marriage was about compromise, wasn't it? If she wanted me to refine my look, what harm was there? If she wished I carried myself with a little more polish, I could make the effort. I convinced myself she was just pushing me to be better, but I was wrong. It wasn't about improvement. It was about me no longer being enough. She began creating distance. When she had plans with her ambitious new friends, she went alone. At a dinner party, I overheard her telling someone I was working late, while I was right there. When I confronted her, she sighed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Image matters," she said. "People judge. You wouldn't understand." That one cut deep. And then came the moment everything clicked. We had been invited to a small gathering, Nothing extravagant, just some of her old college acquaintances. I was eager to go, to be part of her world, to meet the people she valued. But when I told her I'd be joining, she hesitated. It was brief, barely a pause, but I caught it. Then she exhaled, as if weighing her words before saying, "I just think it'd be better if I went alone." She needed to make the right impression, and I, apparently, didn't fit the image she wanted to present. That was it. That was the moment. No dramatic showdown, no tearful goodbye. Just that single sentence. I was no longer a partner. I was an inconvenience. She wasn't trying to fix things. She wasn't hoping to reconnect. She had already decided I didn't belong in her life anymore. She just hadn't said it outright yet. But if she thought I would quietly fade away, let her cast me aside like an outdated accessory, she was mistaken. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations. I just nodded, watching her walk away, letting her words settle deep inside me. But something inside me shifted that night. The moment she dismissed me as someone unworthy, someone she couldn't be seen with, I stopped seeing her as my wife. She thought she had won, that she could erase me, repackage herself into some polished version where I no longer existed. Fine. If she was so desperate to impress her new circle, I'd make sure they got a performance they wouldn't forget. Confronting her wouldn't be enough. I needed something bigger. She had spent years crafting her image, carefully curating the illusion of perfection, surrounding herself with people who only saw what she wanted them to see. But she had overlooked one thing. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall. And I was going to be the one to push her over the edge. I started gathering my arsenal. I combed through memories, recalling every time she had mocked these very people behind closed doors. The snide remarks, the gossip, the biting criticisms she had made when she thought no one was listening. She had worked so hard to claw her way up this artificial social hierarchy, but she had forgotten one fundamental truth. Hypocrisy never stays hidden forever. I opened Facebook and found the event page for the gathering. This wasn't just a casual reunion. It was an exclusive, meticulously curated affair, a stage for old acquaintances to flaunt their success. The guest list was full of names I recognized from stories she had once told me, people she used to ridicule, people she had called shallow, desperate, and fake. And now, she was desperate for their approval. The irony was almost poetic. I clicked the RSVP button. She may have insisted that I stay away, but that decision was never hers to make. And I had no intention of merely making an appearance. I would ensure that by the time the evening ended, every single person in that room would see her exactly as I did. The days leading up to the event were spent in meticulous preparation, not just mentally fortifying myself, but planning every detail to perfection. Throwing a tantrum would be foolish. That would only make me appear petty, insignificant. No, this called for precision. I analyzed how she expected me to act, polished, restrained, inconspicuous. So I would do the opposite. I would be bold, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. I would sidestep their shallow pleasantries, guide conversations into discomfort, and dismantle their fragile illusions with just the right amount of carefully chosen truth. By the time the night was over, her carefully constructed image would be irreversibly altered. I wasn't attending as her husband. I was arriving as the consequence she never saw coming. When the night finally arrived, I was more than prepared. I wasn't just physically present. I was mentally locked in, every move planned, every response anticipated. She wanted a flawless evening, a showcase of her curated existence. What she would get instead was a reality check. I stepped into the venue with intent. It was exactly as I had imagined, ornate, pretentious, a monument to fragile self-importance. The lighting was soft, the decor excessive, the drinks absurdly overpriced. The air hummed with conversation, a sea of empty exchanges where everyone pretended they weren't performing, even though they were. And then I spotted her. She was mid-laugh, surrounded by an audience, slipping effortlessly into the role she had spent years perfecting. Her dress was immaculate, her expression effortlessly poised. She hadn't noticed me yet. I could have let her discover my presence on her own, allowed the anxiety to creep in as she realized I had disregarded her warning. But patience wasn't part of the plan. I walked straight toward her. The moment our eyes met, her body went rigid. For a fraction of a second, she looked as if she had seen a ghost. Then, true to form, she recovered. A too bright, too polished smile emerged. "Oh," she greeted, her voice a touch too controlled. "I wasn't expecting you." I returned the smile, slow and deliberate. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Her circle exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift in energy, but unsure of the cause. I watched as she calculated, scrambling for a way to manage the situation before I shattered the illusion she had so carefully crafted. Her fingers wrapped around my arm, pressing just hard enough to convey a silent warning. "We need to talk. Now." I let her lead me away, keeping my expression calm, my stance effortlessly composed. "What the hell are you doing here?" she demanded, her perfect facade cracking for just a moment. I shrugged with casual ease. "Isn't this a public gathering? And besides, I thought it would be nice for us to be seen together, you know, as husband and wife." Her jaw tightened, her eyes darting around, making sure no one could overhear. "You don't belong here. This night is important. I need you to—" "To what?" I interrupted, tilting my head. "Behave? Stay quiet? Avoid embarrassing you?" She didn't answer, but her expression said enough. I leaned in just slightly. "Relax," I whispered. "I promise this night will be unforgettable." Before she could respond, I turned and walked back into the party as if she no longer existed. She had lost control. I moved through the crowd with ease, inserting myself into conversations, but refusing to adhere to their unspoken etiquette. When someone boasted about their latest business venture, I casually asked how much of it was their father's investment. When another guest raved about their luxury vacation, I inquired whether they truly enjoyed it or simply curated it for Instagram. With each exchange, I chipped away at their well-maintained illusions, forcing them to grapple with the reality they pretended didn't exist. Tension in the room began to rise. People grew uneasy, casting uncertain glances at one another, unsettled by someone who refused to follow the script. She lingered nearby, pretending not to watch me, but I could feel her eyes tracking my every move. The panic in her gaze was unmistakable, her mind working overtime to figure out how to contain me. But she was powerless to stop me without making an even bigger spectacle. Then, I raised the stakes. I wove subtle but precise remarks into conversations, statements that, on the surface, seemed innocuous, but carried just enough weight to fracture her reality. I turned to one of her closest friends, a woman she constantly ridiculed in private, and offered a knowing smile. "You wouldn't believe how often she talks about you. Always has so much to say." I let the words settle, allowing the doubt to take root. Then, I shifted my attention to a man she had always been polite to but privately despised. "It's interesting," I mused. "She used to tell me how much you irritated her, but I suppose people change. I wasn't revealing everything. Not yet. No, this was merely the prelude. I wanted the energy in the room to shift, to make people question her long before I delivered the decisive strike. And it was working. Their expressions changed subtly, flickers of something unspoken dancing in their eyes. Low murmurs wove through the gathering like an undercurrent. For years, she had sculpted her image with precision, ensuring that others saw only what she allowed. But tonight, cracks were forming in that carefully crafted illusion, and I was only getting started. At first, the change was nearly imperceptible, a hesitation in their smiles, a glance that lingered a second too long. But I noticed it. The event, once a perfectly curated display of poise and charm, was beginning to unravel. The smooth surface of pleasantries rippled with unease. I moved deliberately through the crowd, scattering small, irrefutable truths like breadcrumbs, each leading straight back to her. There was no need for spectacle or raised voices. That would be overkill. The beauty of it all? I didn't have to lie. A man she had once dismissed as an insistent social climber approached, chuckling as he recounted an old college story. I let him finish, then offered a casual remark. "It's funny. She once told me you were the most determined person she'd ever met, said you'd do whatever it took to be in the right circles." I smiled as if it were a compliment. His laughter faltered, uncertainty flickering in his expression. My wife's head snapped toward me, her grip tightening around her wine glass. A woman she always referred to as a dear friend approached, greeting us with warmth, asking how we were. Before my wife could answer, I spoke first, my voice light with amusement. "She always says you give the best advice. Anytime she's in a tough spot, she tells me, if anyone knows how to turn things in their favor, it's her." For a fraction of a second, the woman's practiced smile wavered before she forced it back into place. I was planting the seeds of doubt, of unease, and my wife knew it. With every passing moment, I could sense her unraveling. Her body tensed, her eyes flitting across the room as if she could contain the damage through sheer will. But I wasn't finished yet. At one point, she seized my wrist, her voice a furious whisper barely restrained. "You need to stop. Right now." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Stop what?" She exhaled sharply, struggling to maintain her composure. "You know exactly what you're doing." I smiled. "Oh, I'm just making conversation, like everyone else." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're tearing everything apart." I leaned in, voice barely above a murmur. "No, darling, you did that yourself. I'm just making sure they finally see it." She opened her mouth, but before she could form a response, I turned away, rejoining the gathering. The shift in atmosphere was undeniable now. Glances exchanged, whispered speculations growing bolder. It wasn't outright chaos, not yet, but the admiration she thrived on was slipping through her fingers. Then came the final push. A man she frequently derided in private approached, his tone deceptively light, his eyes sharp with accusation. "So, I hear you've had quite a bit to say about me when I'm not around." She stiffened. "What?" "No, that's—" Another voice interrupted. "Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that." Then another. And another. The intricate web she had woven over the years was fraying at the seams, unraveling strand by strand, and all I had to do was stand back and watch. The air had changed. This was no longer just polite discontent. It was suspicion, cold and unrelenting. The whispers grew louder, shifting from curiosity to disbelief, then to outright skepticism. Every conversation circled back to her. The woman who had spent so long building her perfect image now stood in the eye of the storm, watching it all collapse. But I wasn't done yet. I let the weight of it press down on her, let her feel the suffocating realization that control was slipping from her grasp. She tried to recover, laughing too brightly, pulling people aside for hurried explanations, attempting to charm her way back into their favor. But it was futile. She was drowning, and everyone could see it. That's when I decided to end it. I lifted a glass and tapped my fork against it. The crisp chime rang through the room, slicing through the scattered hum of conversation. All eyes turned to me. My wife went rigid. I exhaled slowly, offering a poised smile, the very confidence she had spent years trying to stifle in me. "I just wanted to take a moment," I began, my tone calm, deliberate, to acknowledge something important. There were a few nervous chuckles, some uneasy shuffling. My wife's gaze locked onto mine, desperate, silently begging me to stop. I didn't. "Tonight is significant," I continued, "a chance to reconnect, to celebrate our achievements, to reflect on the past." I met her eyes briefly before turning back to the expectant crowd. But more than anything, it's a night for truth. Silence fell. People were listening now. She inhaled sharply, her grip so tight on her glass I half expected it to shatter. I let the moment linger, let her feel the weight of it. Then I delivered the final blow. Honesty is an odd thing, isn't it? I mused, letting the words settle in the room like an encroaching storm. It's often those who preach it most fervently, who struggle with it the hardest. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. I could see it in their shifting eyes, in the way they stole glances at her, waiting for the inevitable fallout. My wife hesitated, then took a measured step forward. "That's enough," she said, her voice strained. A brittle smile stretched across her face. "Let's not—" I cut her off. "No." She froze. I turned back to the room. "Oh, but we must." The air around us thickened, tense with unspoken truths. "We all know someone like this, don't we?" I continued. "Someone who thrives on deception, who builds relationships not on sincerity but on convenience. The kind who will shower you with compliments, only to dismantle you the moment you're out of earshot." No one spoke, but their silence said everything. I gave a slight nod, acknowledging what we all knew. It's remarkable, really, the effort some people put into sustaining a lie. The way they manipulate, distort the truth, reshape their own narrative, all to create an illusion they hope the world will adore. I turned fully to face her. "But the thing about constructing a false reality," I said, locking eyes with her, "is that sooner or later, the truth catches up." For a moment, everything seemed to suspend in time. Then, the unraveling began. I gestured toward a woman near the back. "She once told me you were her closest friend, that she could always count on you. But I remember how you sighed when she called, how you ridiculed her problems as if they were nothing more than entertainment." The woman's face darkened. My wife's lips parted, but before she could form a defense, I had already turned to another. "And you," I said, addressing a man she had been charming earlier. "She used to say you were insufferable, that she'd rather walk through fire than endure another night listening to your endless monologues about investments." His expression shifted, the mask of politeness cracking. A wave of murmurs swept through the gathering, no longer whispered but voiced in open disbelief. I turned back to her. The color had drained from her face, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as reality sank in. But I wasn't finished. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as if recalling something particularly painful. "And then, of course, there's the greatest lie of them all. The one she told me." Every gaze in the room locked onto us. She said she loved me, that we were equals, that I meant something to her. A humorless chuckle escaped me, void of warmth. But in truth, I was nothing more than a rung on the ladder, a convenience she'd discard the moment I was no longer useful. A sharp inhale from someone in the crowd. She knew where this was heading. I let my gaze drift before settling on a single figure. Then I smiled. "Hey, Adam." A hush fell over the room, so complete it was as if the world had stopped breathing. He stiffened, his entire body tensing. He hadn't expected this, but I made sure he was included. "If you'd like to take it from here," I said casually, "be my guest, because I'm done." And with that, I let the final blow land. The atmosphere grew impossibly heavy, stretching the seconds into eternity as the weight of my words settled. Movements became slow, breaths were held, and my wife, no, my ex-wife, stood there, staring at me as though the ground beneath her had vanished. Because in a way, it had. Her world had collapsed, right before the eyes of those she had spent years trying to impress. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The party had frozen, each guest trapped beneath the magnitude of what had just transpired. I turned, walking toward the door without sparing her another glance. But I could feel it. The desperation in her stance, the panic in her breath, the sheer terror of losing control over the illusion she had so carefully maintained. I had no reason to stay. My work here was finished. As I stepped into the crisp night air, I inhaled deeply. Then, for the first time in years, I smiled. A lightness settled over me, unfamiliar yet welcome. I hadn't realized the weight I had been carrying until it was finally lifted. The exhaustion, the doubt, the endless questioning, it had all dissipated the moment I left that room. As for her, that was another story. I eventually heard what happened after I left. Not from her. She no longer had the privilege of speaking to me. But word travels quickly. The party imploded. People confronted her, demanded explanations, questioned everything she had ever told them. She scrambled, attempted to weave a story that could salvage her image, but the more she spoke, the faster she crumbled. And the truth about people like her? When they start to fall, no one is there to catch them. I imagine she felt it, that sickening realization that the very people she had worked so hard to impress were now turning away. Because that's the flaw of those who build their lives on perception. Once the illusion cracks, it never truly repairs. And the people in that room? They would never see her the same way again. The days that followed were nothing short of merciless. The messages poured in, some laced with barely concealed scorn, others steeped in an eerie, impenetrable silence. Friends who had once been constants in her life now kept their distance, their absence speaking louder than any words ever could. Invitations she had once accepted without a second thought disappeared without a trace, as if they had never existed. The social world she had spent years curating now regarded her as something to be avoided, an untouchable presence lingering at the edges. And the most brutal part, she couldn't refute a single thing. There were no lies, no embellishments on my end. All I did was show them reality, holding up a mirror she could no longer look away from. And the thing about truth? Once it's exposed, it can't be ignored or undone. As for me, I walked away clean, untouched by regret, free of hesitation, entirely devoid of sympathy. I got exactly what I set out for, my divorce. Predictably, she fought tooth and nail to drag it through the mud, flinging baseless accusations, framing herself as the victim, desperate to salvage whatever remained of her standing. But she had nothing left to leverage. No power, no sway, no control. The moment I signed my name on that document, I knew, without a shred of doubt, that it was over. She wanted a life without me, and now she had it. But it wasn't the idyllic, carefully constructed future she had envisioned. It was empty. And the best part? I never had to lift a finger to ruin her. She did it all on her own. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.